What if the greatest lesson about success was written thousands of years ago? What if one of the most destructive forces in your life is something so common, so ordinary, that most people never even notice it controlling their decisions? Every day, millions of people wake up and immediately compare themselves to someone else. Someone has a better job. Someone earns more money. Someone looks more attractive. Someone seems happier, smarter, more successful, or more loved. At first, comparison feels harmless. It can even seem motivating. But hidden beneath that innocent habit is a danger that has destroyed friendships, families, careers, and even entire lives. Long before social media, long before modern psychology, and long before self-help books attempted to explain human behavior, an ancient story revealed the devastating consequences of comparison. It is the story of Cain and Abel. At first glance, it appears to be a simple tale about two brothers. But beneath the surface lies a profound insight into human nature that remains just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve. They grew up in the same family, under the same roof, raised by the same parents. Yet they chose different paths in life. Cain became a farmer, working the soil and cultivating the land. Abel became a shepherd, caring for flocks and living among the fields. Both brothers worked hard. Both contributed value. Both had responsibilities and ambitions. One day, they each brought an offering to God. Cain presented some of the fruits of the ground he had cultivated. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and the best portions he possessed. According to the story, God looked favorably upon Abel's offering, but not upon Cain's. What happened next would change history forever. Cain became angry, not disappointed, not confused, angry. His face fell. His thoughts darkened. His focus shifted away from his own actions and toward his brother. Instead of asking how he could improve, he became consumed by why someone else had been favored. Instead of looking inward, he looked outward. Instead of pursuing growth, he pursued resentment. This moment is where the story becomes deeply personal for every one of us. Because most people believe their greatest obstacles are external. They blame circumstances, competitors, bad luck, or unfair treatment. But often the real enemy is internal. The moment we become obsessed with someone else's success, we stop investing energy into our own development. We begin measuring our worth using another person's achievements as the standard. We start believing that if someone else wins, we somehow lose. Yet success has never been a limited resource. Another person's accomplishments do not reduce your potential. Another person's recognition does not erase your value. Another person's victory does not make your journey less meaningful. But comparison creates the illusion that life is a competition for worth, and once that illusion takes hold, it can quietly poison the mind from within. The tragedy of Cain did not begin when he acted. It began when he allowed a feeling to grow unchecked inside his mind. This is one of the most important lessons hidden within the story. Human beings rarely destroy their lives through a single decision. More often, destruction begins with emotions that are ignored, justified, or secretly nurtured over time. Anger becomes bitterness. Bitterness becomes resentment. Resentment becomes hatred. And hatred eventually seeks expression through actions. The story tells us that before anything irreversible happened, Cain received a warning. He was challenged to examine what was happening within himself. He was given an opportunity to confront his emotions before they gained control. In modern language, we might call this emotional awareness. Psychologists today understand something that this ancient story recognized thousands of years ago. Emotions are not dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous when they control behavior. Everyone experiences jealousy. Everyone experiences insecurity. Everyone experiences disappointment. The problem is not feeling these emotions. The problem is allowing them to become the foundation of our decisions. Think about how often comparison quietly enters everyday life. A colleague receives a promotion. A friend buys a beautiful house. A classmate achieves impressive grades. A business competitor grows faster than expected. Someone you know appears to have the relationship, lifestyle, or success that you desire. In those moments, you stand at the same crossroads that Cain faced. One path leads to growth. The other leads to resentment. Growth asks a difficult question. What can I learn from this situation? Resentment asks a different question. Why do they deserve it more than I do? Growth creates possibilities. Resentment creates prisons. The difference may seem small at first, but over time it shapes entire destinies. Many people spend years trapped in silent competition with people who are not even competing with them. They scroll through social media comparing their lives to carefully selected highlights from strangers. They compare the beginning of their journey to someone else's final chapter. They compare their weaknesses to another person's strengths. The result is predictable. Confidence begins to fade. Gratitude disappears. Progress feels invisible because attention is focused elsewhere. The irony is that comparison often prevents the very success people desire. Imagine a runner who constantly turns his head to watch every other competitor on the track. Eventually, he loses focus on his own lane. His pace slows. His balance suffers. His performance declines. The same principle applies to life. Excellence requires attention. Attention requires focus. And focus becomes impossible when the mind is consumed by what everyone else is doing. Cain stopped focusing on his own offering. He stopped focusing on his own growth. His attention became fixed on Abel. That shift changed everything. What could have been a moment of self-reflection became a moment of self-destruction. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history and throughout our personal lives. Entire careers have been ruined by envy. Businesses have collapsed because leaders became obsessed with rivals instead of customers. Friendships have ended because one person's success triggered another person's insecurity. Families have fractured because comparison replaced appreciation. The hidden danger is not merely that comparison makes us unhappy. The deeper danger is that comparison blinds us to the opportunities directly in front of us. To understand the true power of this lesson, we need to look beyond the ancient setting and recognize how deeply comparison influences modern life. Never before in human history have people been exposed to so many opportunities to compare themselves with others. A few generations ago, most individuals compared themselves to a small circle of neighbors, co-workers, friends, and relatives. Today, a single swipe on a phone can expose someone to the wealth, beauty, achievements, vacations, relationships, and lifestyles of thousands of people from around the world. The human mind was never designed to process such a constant stream of comparisons. As a result, many people live with a persistent feeling that they are falling behind, even when they are making meaningful progress. This creates a dangerous psychological trap. The more people compare, the less they appreciate what they already have. The less they appreciate what they have, the more dissatisfied they become. The more dissatisfied they become, the more desperately they seek validation from external sources. Yet external validation can never permanently solve an internal problem. Consider a successful professional who earns a comfortable income and enjoys a stable life. For years, that person feels grateful and fulfilled. Then a colleague receives a larger promotion and a higher salary. Suddenly, nothing about the original life has changed, yet satisfaction disappears. The house remains the same. The income remains the same. The opportunities remain the same. The only thing that changed was the comparison. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Often, suffering is not created by reality itself. It is created by the way we interpret reality. Cain's pain was not caused by Abel's success. It was caused by what Cain believed Abel's success meant about him. That distinction is crucial. When someone else succeeds, we automatically assign meaning to that event. We may interpret it as evidence that we are inadequate, overlooked, less talented, or less valuable. But those interpretations are assumptions, not facts. Another person's achievement says very little about your worth. Yet countless people allow these assumptions to shape their identity. Philosophers throughout history have warned about this tendency. Many have argued that happiness depends less on external circumstances and more on the ability to govern one's own mind. The story of Cain and Abel illustrates this principle with remarkable clarity. Cain's external circumstances were not what destroyed him. His inability to manage his internal world was the true source of his downfall. This is why emotional mastery is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. Emotional mastery does not mean suppressing feelings. It means recognizing them without becoming controlled by them. Imagine that jealousy appears in your mind. Most people immediately react in one of two ways. They either deny the feeling or they surrender to it. Neither response is healthy. A wiser approach is to observe the emotion honestly. You acknowledge its presence without allowing it to dictate your behavior. You become curious rather than reactive. You ask yourself why the feeling exists and what it might reveal about your desires, fears, or insecurities. In this way, even uncomfortable emotions can become teachers. Jealousy often points towards something we deeply value. Envy may reveal goals we have neglected. Disappointment may expose expectations that need adjustment. The emotion itself is not the enemy. The enemy is unconscious obedience to the emotion. Cain felt anger. The critical mistake was not the feeling. The critical mistake was allowing that feeling to become the lens through which he viewed reality, his brother, and ultimately himself. One of the most powerful questions we can ask ourselves is this: what would have happened if Cain had chosen a different response? Imagine for a moment that after seeing Abel's offering accepted, Cain paused and reflected. Imagine that instead of feeding his anger, he became curious. Instead of viewing Abel as a rival, he viewed him as an example. Instead of asking, "Why was he chosen?" he asked, "What can I learn?" The entire story would have unfolded differently. This alternative possibility highlights a principle that separates highly successful individuals from those who remain trapped in cycles of frustration. Successful people are not immune to comparison. They simply use it differently. When they encounter someone who performs at a higher level, they do not automatically interpret that success as a threat. They see it as information. They study it. They learn from it. They adapt. They improve. In contrast, people dominated by insecurity often interpret the success of others as a personal attack. They assume that recognition is limited, opportunities are scarce, and value must be fought over like a finite resource. This mindset creates unnecessary conflict because it transforms potential teachers into perceived enemies. Think about some of the greatest athletes in the world. Many became extraordinary not because they ignored talented competitors, but because they learned from them. They observed techniques, studied habits, and identified areas for improvement. The presence of excellence inspired growth rather than resentment. The same principle applies in business, education, leadership, and personal development. Every person who achieves something remarkable can either become a source of inspiration or a source of bitterness. The choice depends largely on our mindset. This idea is particularly important because modern culture often encourages unhealthy comparison. People are constantly told to measure their success against others. Rankings, followers, salaries, titles, possessions, and social status become scoreboards in an endless competition. Yet the most meaningful achievements in life rarely fit neatly onto a scoreboard. How do you measure integrity? How do you measure wisdom? How do you measure kindness, resilience, character, or inner peace? Some of the most valuable qualities a person can possess are invisible to public recognition. Cain focused on an external outcome. He saw Abel receiving favor and immediately compared results. But results tell only part of the story. They rarely reveal the full journey, the sacrifices made, the lessons learned, or the challenges overcome. This remains true today. People compare their ordinary days to someone else's highlight reel. They compare their private struggles to another person's public image. They compare incomplete information and then draw conclusions that damage their confidence. Imagine standing at the base of a mountain and seeing someone already near the summit. You might feel discouraged if you assume they started from the same position at the same time. But what if they began years earlier? What if they faced obstacles you never saw? What if their path required sacrifices you would not choose? Context changes everything. Yet comparison often ignores context completely. It reduces complex human journeys into simplistic judgments. This is one reason gratitude is such a powerful antidote to comparison. Gratitude shifts attention away from what is missing and toward what is present. It reminds us that value does not come from having more than someone else. Value comes from recognizing and appreciating what already exists in our lives. A grateful person is not blind to ambition. A grateful person can still pursue growth, success, and improvement. The difference is that growth emerges from a foundation of appreciation rather than a foundation of inadequacy. There is another layer to the story of Cain and Abel that many people overlook. It is not only a story about comparison. It is also a story about responsibility. One of the most common reactions to disappointment is the search for someone or something to blame. When life does not unfold as expected, the mind naturally looks outward. We blame circumstances. We blame other people. We blame unfair systems. We blame bad luck. Sometimes these external factors are real and significant. Yet, even when obstacles genuinely exist, the question that determines our future remains the same. What will we do next? This is where responsibility becomes transformative. Responsibility is often misunderstood. Many people hear the word and think it means accepting fault for everything that goes wrong. But true responsibility is not about blame. It is about ownership. It is the willingness to acknowledge that while we cannot control every event in life, we can control our response to those events. Cain faced a moment of disappointment. That disappointment was real. The story does not ask us to pretend otherwise. What matters is what followed. Rather than taking ownership of his emotions, he projected them outward. Rather than examining himself, he focused on Abel. Rather than seeking improvement, he sought someone to blame for his pain. This pattern continues to shape countless lives today. Consider a person who fails to achieve a career goal. One response is to become consumed by resentment toward those who succeeded. Another response is to analyze what can be learned, improved, or adjusted moving forward. The first response provides temporary emotional comfort because it avoids self-examination. The second response is more difficult, but it creates the possibility of growth. The same principle applies in relationships. When conflicts arise, it is easy to focus exclusively on the other person's mistakes. It is much harder to ask what role our own actions, assumptions, or communication may have played. Yet meaningful progress often begins with that difficult question. Responsibility is empowering because it places the focus on what can still be influenced. Blame focuses on the past. Responsibility focuses on the future. Blame asks, "Who caused this?" Responsibility asks, "What can I do now?" This distinction may appear subtle, but it has enormous consequences over time. People who consistently embrace responsibility develop resilience. They learn to adapt, recover, and grow. People who consistently embrace blame often remain trapped in frustration because their sense of control depends on factors outside themselves. The story of Cain and Abel reminds us that the most important battles are often internal rather than external. Many people spend years trying to change their circumstances while neglecting the attitudes that shape their experience of those circumstances. They assume that happiness will arrive when they achieve a certain income, acquire a certain possession, receive a certain title, or gain a certain level of recognition. Yet history is filled with individuals who achieved all of those things and still felt empty. Why? Because external success cannot permanently compensate for unresolved internal struggles. A person who is ruled by envy will remain dissatisfied regardless of how much they achieve. A person who is controlled by comparison will always find someone else who appears to have more. There will always be someone wealthier, more accomplished, more attractive, more influential, or more celebrated. If self-worth depends on being superior to others, peace becomes impossible because the competition never ends. This is why genuine confidence is fundamentally different from superiority. Superiority depends on comparison. Confidence does not. Superiority says, I am valuable because I am better than someone else. Confidence says, I am valuable because my worth is not determined by comparison in the first place. That distinction changes everything. The difference between confidence and superiority is one of the most important lessons we can carry into modern life. Many people spend years chasing a feeling they call confidence, but what they are actually pursuing is superiority. They want to feel valuable by being more successful than others, more admired than others, or more accomplished than others. The problem with this approach is that it creates a fragile identity. If your sense of worth depends on being ahead of someone else, then every success around you becomes a threat. Every talented colleague becomes a rival. Every promotion earned by another person feels like a loss. Every achievement you witness creates anxiety rather than inspiration. This is the psychological prison that comparison builds. From the outside, a person may appear successful, but internally they remain trapped in constant competition. They can never fully enjoy their accomplishments because someone else always seems to have more. They can never experience lasting satisfaction because their standards are continuously moving. They live on a treadmill that never stops. Cain's tragedy illustrates this perfectly. The moment he measured his worth against Abel, he entered a game that could only produce suffering. His attention shifted away from his own growth and toward another person's outcome. In many ways, this is still one of the most common mistakes people make today. They become so focused on comparing results that they forget to evaluate progress. Yet progress is often a far more meaningful measure of success than comparison. Imagine two individuals learning a new skill. One person improves dramatically over the course of a year, but remains less skilled than an expert. The other person makes no meaningful improvement, but happens to be slightly ahead of a beginner. Which person is truly succeeding? Most people would agree that the first individual is making real progress. Yet comparison often causes us to ignore our own growth simply because someone else is further ahead. This is why wise people learn to compete primarily with their former selves rather than with other people. They ask different questions. Am I wiser than I was last year? Am I more disciplined than I was 6 months ago? Have I developed stronger character, greater patience, or deeper understanding? These questions create a healthier foundation for growth because they focus on personal development rather than external rankings. The remarkable thing about personal growth is that it is available to everyone. Not everyone will become wealthy. Not everyone will become famous. Not everyone will receive public recognition. But everyone has the opportunity to become wiser, stronger, kinder, and more capable than they were before. That journey belongs to each individual regardless of circumstances. The story of Cain and Abel also reveals how quickly unchecked emotions can distort perception. When envy takes hold, it changes the way people interpret reality. Neutral events begin to feel personal. Other people's achievements seem unfair. Ordinary setbacks appear catastrophic. The mind starts constructing narratives that justify resentment. This process is dangerous because once people become attached to these narratives, they stop seeing reality clearly. They no longer respond to what is actually happening. Instead, they respond to the story they have created in their minds. Modern psychology has repeatedly demonstrated how powerful these mental narratives can be. Two people can experience the same event and interpret it completely differently. One sees an opportunity for growth. The other sees evidence of failure. One sees a challenge. The other sees an injustice. The external situation may be identical, but the internal interpretation produces dramatically different outcomes. This is why mastering your thoughts is often just as important as mastering your circumstances. The battle that determines your future frequently takes place long before anyone else can see it. It begins quietly in the stories you tell yourself about success, failure, other people, and your own worth. The stories we tell ourselves have extraordinary power. They shape our emotions, influence our decisions, and ultimately determine the direction of our lives. This is why two people can face similar circumstances and arrive at completely different destinations. One person interprets adversity as proof that life is unfair and that success belongs only to others. Another interprets the same adversity as a challenge that can develop strength, wisdom, and resilience. Over time, those interpretations become habits. Those habits become behaviors. Those behaviors become character. And character shapes destiny. Cain's story serves as a warning about what happens when destructive narratives are allowed to grow unchecked. Somewhere along the way, he began telling himself a story. We are not given every detail, but we can observe the consequences. He interpreted Abel's acceptance as a personal rejection. He interpreted another person's success as evidence of his own diminished worth. He allowed disappointment to evolve into resentment, and resentment eventually consumed his judgment. This progression remains remarkably relevant because modern life provides endless opportunities to create similar narratives. A coworker receives praise, and the mind whispers, "They are valued more than you." A friend achieves financial success, and the mind whispers, "You are falling behind." A sibling receives attention, and the mind whispers, "You matter less." None of these conclusions are necessarily true. Yet when repeated often enough, they begin to feel true. Human beings rarely act according to objective reality. More often, they act according to their perception of reality. This is why protecting the quality of your thinking is so important. Every day, your mind is interpreting events, assigning meaning, and constructing explanations. Some of those explanations empower you. Others quietly undermine you. Consider the difference between these two interpretations. Imagine a colleague is promoted ahead of you. One interpretation says, "This proves I am not good enough." Another says, "This shows me what is possible and highlights areas where I can improve." The event is identical. The meaning is different. And because the meaning is different, the emotional and behavioral outcomes are different as well. The first interpretation produces discouragement and resentment. The second produces motivation and growth. This principle extends far beyond careers. It influences relationships, finances, education, leadership, and personal development. The quality of your life is often determined less by what happens to you and more by the meaning you assign to what happens. Philosophers have explored this idea for centuries. They recognize that external events are frequently outside our control, but our responses remain within our influence. The story of Cain and Abel reflects this wisdom long before it was formally described by philosophers or psychologists. Cain could not control Abel's acceptance. He could control his response. That response became the turning point. Every person faces similar turning points throughout life. Most of them appear ordinary at the time. A moment of criticism, a moment of disappointment, a moment of rejection, a moment when someone else succeeds while we struggle. These moments test the stories we believe about ourselves. They reveal whether our identity is rooted in comparison or in something deeper. If your identity depends entirely on external validation, life becomes emotionally unstable. Praise makes you feel worthy. Criticism makes you feel worthless. Success creates confidence. Failure destroys it. You become dependent on circumstances for your sense of value. But when your identity is grounded in character, growth, and purpose, external events lose much of their power to define you. Success becomes enjoyable, but not essential to your self-worth. Failure becomes painful, but not devastating. You remain steady because your foundation is internal rather than external. This kind of stability is one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can achieve. Freedom is often misunderstood. Many people think freedom means having unlimited choices, unlimited resources, or the ability to do whatever they want whenever they want. Yet some of the most financially successful and socially admired individuals in the world remain prisoners of comparison, insecurity, and fear. Their circumstances may appear impressive, but their inner lives are governed by forces they cannot control. True freedom begins when a person is no longer enslaved by the need to measure their worth against others. This freedom allows someone to celebrate another person's success without feeling diminished. It allows someone to admire excellence without experiencing envy. It allows someone to pursue ambitious goals while maintaining gratitude for the present moment. In many ways, this is the opposite of the path Cain chose. Instead of finding security within himself, he looked outward for validation. When that validation seemed absent, his emotional world collapsed. This pattern still affects countless people today because comparison creates a fragile foundation for identity. Any identity built upon comparison requires constant maintenance. There must always be someone to outperform, someone to surpass, or someone to impress. The moment that external reference point changes, confidence begins to crumble. Consider how often people postpone happiness until they reach a future milestone. They tell themselves they will finally feel successful when they earn a certain income, receive a certain promotion, purchase a certain home, or achieve a certain status. But when they arrive at that milestone, satisfaction is often brief. Soon another comparison emerges. Another target appears. Another standard replaces the previous one. The cycle continues. This phenomenon has been observed throughout history and across cultures. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt to improvements in their circumstances. What once seemed extraordinary eventually becomes normal. Without gratitude and self-awareness, people quickly return to dissatisfaction because their attention shifts toward what they still lack. This is why comparison and contentment struggle to coexist. Comparison trains the mind to focus on absence. Contentment trains the mind to recognize abundance. Comparison asks, "Why don't I have what they have?" Contentment asks, "How can I appreciate what I already possess while continuing to grow?" These questions produce dramatically different experiences of life. One generates chronic frustration. The other generates peace without eliminating ambition. It is important to understand that contentment does not mean settling for mediocrity. Some people fear that gratitude will make them complacent. In reality, the opposite is often true. People who are secure in their worth are frequently more willing to take risks, pursue goals, and embrace challenges because failure does not threaten their identity. They can strive for excellence without becoming emotionally dependent on outcomes. They understand that success is desirable, but it is not the source of their value. This distinction transforms the way a person approaches achievement. Instead of pursuing success to prove their worth, they pursue success as an expression of their abilities and purpose. The difference may sound subtle, but it changes everything. When success becomes a tool for proving worth, fear dominates the process. Every setback feels personal. Every mistake feels humiliating. Every competitor feels threatening. But when success becomes an expression of growth and contribution, the experience becomes healthier and more sustainable. Challenges become opportunities to learn. Mistakes become sources of information. Competitors become sources of inspiration. The external actions may look similar, but the internal experience is entirely different. Cain's story reminds us that two people can stand in the same situation and move in opposite directions depending on how they interpret what they see. One interpretation leads toward growth, wisdom, and peace. The other leads toward resentment, bitterness, and destruction. The choice begins long before any visible action occurs. It begins in the hidden world of thought, emotion, and perspective. The hidden world of thought, emotion, and perspective is where every major transformation begins. Long before people change their careers, relationships, habits, or circumstances, something changes within their minds. A new belief is formed. A different perspective is adopted. A healthier interpretation replaces a destructive one. This internal shift often appears insignificant at first, yet it has the power to alter the course of an entire life. The story of Cain and Abel illustrates this truth with remarkable clarity because the decisive moment occurred before any outward action took place. The real battle was not between two brothers. The real battle was between two possible responses to disappointment. Every person encounters this battle repeatedly throughout life. It appears whenever expectations are not met. It appears whenever recognition goes to someone else. It appears whenever effort does not immediately produce the desired result. In those moments, the mind begins searching for meaning. That search can lead toward wisdom or toward resentment. One path asks, "What can this experience teach me?" The other asks, "Who can I blame for how I feel?" One path strengthens character. The other weakens it. The challenge is that resentment often feels justified. When people compare themselves to others, they can usually find evidence that seems to support their frustration. Someone else may have received opportunities they did not receive. Someone else may possess advantages they never had. Someone else's journey may genuinely appear easier. These observations can be true. Life is not perfectly equal, and pretending otherwise does not help anyone. However, recognizing inequality is different from becoming defined by it. The most resilient individuals understand that while circumstances influence outcomes, they do not completely determine them. They focus on what remains within their control rather than becoming consumed by what does not. This mindset has repeatedly separated people who thrive from those who remain trapped in bitterness. Throughout history, countless individuals have faced disadvantages, setbacks, rejection, and hardship. Some allowed those experiences to become permanent excuses. Others transformed them into sources of strength. The difference often came down to perspective. Perspective does not eliminate pain. It does not erase injustice. It does not guarantee success. What it does is determine whether painful experiences become prisons or teachers. Consider the role of failure in personal growth. Most successful people have experienced significant failure at some point in their lives. Businesses collapse. Careers stall. Relationships end. Goals remain unfulfilled. Failure is not unusual. What matters is the story attached to it. One person experiences failure and concludes, "I am not capable." Another experiences failure and concludes, "I need a different strategy." The first interpretation attacks identity. The second addresses behavior. The first creates hopelessness. The second creates possibility. This distinction is essential because growth requires the ability to separate who you are from what happens to you. Cain appears to have merged these two things together. He interpreted an unfavorable outcome as a statement about his worth. Once that interpretation took hold, his emotional reaction intensified. Many people make the same mistake today. They confuse temporary setbacks with permanent identities. They treat rejection as proof of inadequacy. They treat criticism as proof of worthlessness. They treat another person's success as proof of their own failure. Yet none of these conclusions are logically necessary. They are interpretations, and interpretations can be challenged. One of the most powerful habits a person can develop is the habit of questioning destructive assumptions. When jealousy appears, ask what it is trying to teach you. When disappointment appears, ask what expectations may need adjustment. When comparison appears, ask whether you are evaluating yourself fairly. These questions create space between emotion and action. Within that space lies the possibility of wisdom. Without that space, emotions often take control and lead people toward decisions they later regret. The space between emotion and action is one of the most valuable spaces a human being can create. It may last only a few seconds, yet those few seconds can determine the direction of an entire relationship, career, or life. When people act immediately on intense emotions, they often surrender control to impulses that were never designed to guide wise decision-making. Anger demands immediate action. Fear demands immediate retreat. Envy demands immediate comparison. Pride demands immediate defense. These emotions are powerful, but power alone does not make them trustworthy. The ability to pause, reflect, and choose a response rather than merely reacting is one of the defining characteristics of emotional maturity. The story of Cain and Abel can be understood as a lesson in what happens when that pause disappears. Instead of creating distance between his emotions and his actions, Cain allowed his emotions to become his guide. The consequences were tragic. While most people will never face circumstances as dramatic as those described in the ancient story, they encounter smaller versions of the same challenge every day. A harsh comment triggers anger. A colleague's achievement triggers jealousy. A friend's success triggers insecurity. A financial setback triggers frustration. In each case, there is a brief moment when a choice becomes possible. The emotion arrives automatically. The response does not have to. This distinction is incredibly important because it restores personal agency. Many people speak as though emotions force them to behave in certain ways. They say, "I couldn't help it. I was angry," or "anyone would have reacted that way." Yet history is filled with examples of individuals who experienced intense emotions and still chose disciplined responses. The difference was not the absence of emotion. The difference was the presence of self-control. Self-control is often viewed as a restrictive quality, but in reality, it is a liberating one. A person who cannot control anger is controlled by anger. A person who cannot control envy is controlled by envy. A person who cannot control impulses becomes dependent on whatever emotion happens to be strongest in a given moment. Freedom, therefore, is not the absence of restraint. Freedom is the ability to act according to values rather than impulses. This insight has practical implications for every area of life. Consider leadership. Great leaders are not those who never feel frustration. They are those who refuse to let frustration dictate their decisions. Consider parenting. Effective parents are not those who never become irritated. They are those who respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Consider relationships. Strong relationships are not built by people who never experience conflict. They are built by people who manage conflict without allowing temporary emotions to destroy long-term trust. The same principle applies to personal growth. If you allow every emotional fluctuation to determine your behavior, consistency becomes impossible. Motivation rises and falls. Confidence rises and falls. Circumstances improve and worsen. But meaningful progress requires stability through those changes. This is why discipline often accomplishes what motivation cannot. Motivation is emotional. Discipline is intentional. Motivation says, I feel like doing this today. Discipline says, I will do this because it aligns with my values and goals. Over time, discipline produces results that emotions alone rarely sustain. In many ways, the warning embedded within the story of Cain and Abel is not simply about envy. It is about what happens when emotions become masters rather than servants. Emotions are valuable signals. They provide information about our experiences, desires, fears, and needs. But they were never meant to function as unquestioned authorities. Wisdom requires listening to emotions without surrendering to them. It requires acknowledging their presence while maintaining the ability to choose a thoughtful response. That ability often determines whether disappointment becomes a catalyst for growth or the beginning of destruction. One of the greatest misconceptions about personal growth is the belief that wisdom arrives automatically with age or experience. In reality, experience alone teaches very little. Many people repeat the same mistakes for years because they never pause long enough to learn from what they have lived through. Wisdom emerges not from experience itself, but from reflection upon experience. It is the ability to examine events honestly, identify lessons, and apply those lessons to future decisions. The story of Cain and Abel invites exactly this kind of reflection because it reveals patterns that continue to shape human behavior thousands of years later. The names, settings, and circumstances may belong to an ancient world, but the emotions remain familiar. Jealousy remains familiar. Insecurity remains familiar. Resentment remains familiar. The temptation to compare ourselves with others remains familiar. Because these patterns are universal, the lessons are timeless. One of the most valuable lessons concerns the difference between achievement and fulfillment. Modern society often treats these concepts as if they are identical. People are encouraged to pursue achievement with the assumption that fulfillment will automatically follow. Earn more money and you will be fulfilled. Gain more recognition and you will be fulfilled. Reach a higher position and you will be fulfilled. Yet countless examples demonstrate that achievement and fulfillment are not the same thing. Many highly accomplished individuals continue to struggle with dissatisfaction because fulfillment depends on factors that achievement alone cannot provide. A person can achieve impressive results while remaining trapped in comparison. A person can accumulate wealth while remaining consumed by envy. A person can gain influence while remaining deeply insecure. External success cannot automatically solve internal conflicts. This is one reason why the lesson of Cain and Abel remains so relevant. The story directs attention inward. It challenges us to examine the conditions of our own hearts and minds rather than focusing exclusively on external outcomes. This inward focus is uncomfortable because it removes many of the excuses people prefer to rely upon. It is easier to blame circumstances than to confront insecurity. It is easier to criticize others than to acknowledge personal weaknesses. It is easier to compare than to reflect. Yet meaningful growth almost always begins with honest self-examination. Consider how much energy people invest in monitoring the lives of others. They analyze other people's careers, relationships, finances, appearances, and achievements. They know who is succeeding, who is struggling, and who appears to be winning according to society's standards. But many of those same individuals spend very little time understanding themselves. They rarely examine their assumptions, motivations, fears, or habits. As a result, they become experts on other people's lives while remaining strangers to their own. Self-awareness changes this pattern. Self-awareness involves paying attention to the internal forces that shape behavior. It requires asking difficult questions. Why does another person's success bother me? Why do I crave certain forms of validation? Why do I react so strongly to criticism? What fears are influencing my decisions? These questions are not always comfortable, but they create opportunities for growth that comparison never can. Comparison directs attention outward. Self-awareness directs attention inward. One often produces frustration. The other often produces transformation. This does not mean ignoring the outside world. Learning from others remains valuable. Inspiration remains valuable. Healthy competition remains valuable. The difference lies in the purpose. When attention is directed toward others in order to learn, growth becomes possible. When attention is directed toward others in order to measure personal worth, suffering becomes likely. The same external observation can produce completely different results depending on the mindset behind it. This is why emotional maturity requires more than controlling reactions. It requires understanding the beliefs that generate those reactions in the first place. Lasting change occurs when the underlying perspective changes. Once perspective changes, behavior often follows naturally. Perspective has the power to transform not only how we interpret the world, but also how we experience ourselves within it. Two people can possess similar abilities, face similar obstacles, and live under similar circumstances, yet their lives unfold in dramatically different ways because they see reality through different lenses. One lens magnifies scarcity. The other magnifies possibility. One lens focuses on what is missing. The other focuses on what can be built. One lens turns every success of another person into a reminder of personal inadequacy. The other turns every success into evidence that growth is possible. The story of Cain and Abel encourages us to examine the lens through which we view our own lives. It asks a question that remains deeply relevant. When you see someone else succeed, what happens inside you? The answer to that question often reveals more about your mindset than about the other person's achievement. For some people, another person's success sparks inspiration. They think, if it is possible for them, perhaps it is possible for me as well. For others, the same event sparks discouragement. They think, their success proves that I am not enough. The external reality is identical, yet the internal experience is completely different. This difference matters because repeated thoughts eventually become beliefs, and beliefs influence behavior. A person who believes growth is possible tends to take action. A person who believes success belongs only to others often hesitates. Over time, those different behaviors create different outcomes, which then appear to confirm the original beliefs. In this way, mindset can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This principle is visible in nearly every area of life. Students who believe they can improve often study with greater persistence. Entrepreneurs who believe challenges can be overcome are more likely to continue after setbacks. Athletes who view failure as feedback tend to improve more rapidly than those who view failure as proof of inadequacy. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Perspective influences effort, effort influences results, and results reinforce perspective. This cycle can work for us or against us depending on the beliefs we choose to cultivate. The challenge is that negative perspectives often feel more convincing than positive ones. The human mind naturally pays attention to threats, problems, and potential dangers. This tendency helped our ancestors survive, but it can create difficulties in modern life. We become highly skilled at noticing what is wrong while overlooking what is going right. We remember criticism more vividly than praise. We focus on shortcomings more than progress. We compare our weaknesses to other people's strengths. Left unchecked, this tendency can gradually distort our view of reality. That is why intentional practices such as gratitude, reflection, and self-awareness are so important. They help restore balance. Gratitude reminds us of what already exists. Reflection helps us learn from experience. Self-awareness allows us to recognize when destructive patterns are beginning to take hold. Together, these practices create a healthier relationship with success, failure, and comparison. Imagine how different Cain's story might have been if gratitude had guided his perspective. Instead of focusing exclusively on what he lacked, he might have recognized what he already possessed. Instead of viewing Abel as a rival, he might have appreciated him as a brother. Instead of becoming consumed by an unfavorable outcome, he might have focused on future opportunities to grow. The entire trajectory of the story could have changed. This possibility is significant because it reminds us that our future is often shaped by seemingly small choices of perspective. A single interpretation can influence a decision. A decision can influence a habit. A habit can influence character. And character can influence destiny. The process is gradual, but its effects are profound. Every day presents new opportunities to choose the lens through which we see ourselves, others, and the world around us. Every day presents new opportunities to choose, but many of those choices are so subtle that they pass unnoticed. We tend to think of life-changing decisions as dramatic moments: accepting a job offer, starting a business, ending a relationship, moving to a new city. Yet the foundations of those larger decisions are often built through smaller choices repeated over time. The choice to dwell on resentment or practice gratitude. The choice to compare or to focus on growth. The choice to react impulsively or respond thoughtfully. These decisions may seem insignificant in isolation, but their cumulative effect is enormous. The story of Cain and Abel reminds us that a person's destiny is not usually shaped by a single moment. It is shaped by the habits of thought and emotion that lead to that moment. This understanding is empowering because it means transformation does not require waiting for extraordinary circumstances. Change can begin today, in ordinary situations, through ordinary choices. Consider the next time you encounter someone who appears more successful than you. Perhaps they earn more money. Perhaps they receive recognition you desire. Perhaps they possess skills you admire. In that moment, several responses become possible. You can interpret their success as evidence of your inadequacy. You can dismiss their achievement and search for reasons why it does not matter. You can secretly resent them for what they have accomplished. Or you can choose a different path. You can become curious. You can ask what habits, decisions, or principles contributed to their success. You can allow their achievement to expand your sense of possibility rather than diminish your sense of worth. This shift may seem simple, but it fundamentally changes the emotional experience. Instead of feeling threatened, you feel inspired. Instead of feeling defeated, you feel motivated. Instead of becoming trapped in comparison, you move toward growth. The same principle applies to setbacks and disappointments. Every failure contains multiple possible interpretations. One interpretation says, "This proves I am incapable." Another says, "This reveals something I need to learn." One interpretation closes doors. The other opens them. Over time, these interpretations influence resilience. Resilient people are not individuals who never experience difficulty. They are individuals who consistently choose constructive interpretations in the face of difficulty. They refuse to allow temporary setbacks to become permanent definitions of who they are. This perspective is particularly important in a culture that often celebrates outcomes more than character. Society frequently rewards visible achievements because they are easy to measure. Titles can be measured. Salaries can be measured. Awards can be measured. Social status can be measured. Character is different. Integrity, humility, patience, wisdom, courage, and self-control are more difficult to quantify, yet they often determine the quality of a person's life far more than external accomplishments. The story of Cain and Abel ultimately points toward this deeper truth. The central issue was not merely what happened externally. The central issue was the condition of the heart. External outcomes served as a catalyst that revealed an internal struggle already taking place. This remains true today. Challenges often reveal qualities that comfort conceals. Success can reveal character. Failure can reveal character. Competition can reveal character. Relationships can reveal character. Under pressure, the beliefs and values that truly guide a person become visible. That is why personal development cannot focus solely on external achievements. External success without internal growth often creates fragile foundations. A person may appear successful while remaining vulnerable to envy, insecurity, and resentment. But when internal growth accompanies external achievement, success becomes more meaningful and more sustainable. The goal is not simply to build a successful life. The goal is to become the kind of person capable of handling success, failure, praise, criticism, gain, and loss without losing sight of what truly matters. That journey begins with the choices we make long before anyone else notices them. Long before anyone else notices them, the most important battles of life are already being fought. They are fought in private moments when nobody is watching. They are fought in conversations we have with ourselves. They are fought in the interpretations we choose, the emotions we nurture, and the habits we repeat. By the time a behavior becomes visible to the world, it has often been developing internally for weeks, months, or even years. This is one reason why character matters so much. Character is what guides decisions when external pressure, recognition, or accountability are absent. It is the invisible framework that influences how a person responds to both success and adversity. The story of Cain and Abel is ultimately a story about character under pressure. The external event was relatively simple. One brother experienced acceptance while the other experienced disappointment. Yet that event revealed a profound difference in how each responded internally. Life continues to present similar tests to every generation. The details change, but the underlying challenge remains the same. How do we respond when things do not go our way? How do we respond when someone else receives what we wanted? How do we respond when effort and outcome do not seem perfectly aligned? These moments reveal whether our identity is rooted in comparison or in something more stable. One of the greatest dangers of comparison is that it encourages people to build their identity on unstable foundations. If your worth depends on being more successful than someone else, your confidence will always be vulnerable. There will always be another person with greater achievements, more resources, or broader recognition. If your worth depends on constant validation, your emotional state will depend on forces outside your control. Praise will lift you temporarily. Criticism will crush you unnecessarily. Success will inflate your confidence. Failure will destroy it. Such a life becomes emotionally exhausting because stability is constantly threatened by changing circumstances. A stronger foundation is built upon principles that do not depend entirely on external outcomes. Character, integrity, growth, purpose, and contribution provide this kind of foundation. These qualities remain meaningful whether recognition arrives or not. They remain valuable whether circumstances are favorable or unfavorable. They provide a sense of identity that is not constantly shaken by comparison. This does not mean ignoring ambition. Ambition can be healthy when it is directed toward meaningful goals. The problem arises when ambition becomes entangled with self-worth. Once that happens, every goal carries emotional weight far beyond its practical significance. Failure becomes an attack on identity rather than a learning experience. Success becomes a requirement for feeling valuable rather than a rewarding outcome of effort. This creates unnecessary suffering because life inevitably includes both victories and setbacks. People who understand this distinction tend to navigate challenges more effectively. They pursue excellence without becoming dependent on it for self-respect. They work hard while recognizing that outcomes are not always fully within their control. They celebrate achievements without allowing achievements to define them completely. In many ways, this perspective represents the opposite of envy. Envy focuses on what another person has. Wisdom focuses on who you are becoming. Envy asks, why do they have that? Wisdom asks, what kind of person do I want to become? The first question often leads outward toward comparison. The second leads inward toward growth. Over the long term, inward growth tends to produce far greater fulfillment than outward comparison. People who dedicate themselves to becoming wiser, kinder, more disciplined, and more resilient often discover that these qualities enrich every area of life. Relationships improve. Decision-making improves. Emotional stability improves. Even external success frequently improves because personal growth enhances the ability to create value and persevere through difficulties. The ancient story of Cain and Abel continues to endure because it speaks directly to this timeless reality. The quality of our lives is profoundly influenced by the quality of our inner world. What we choose to nurture within ourselves eventually shapes what we experience around us. What we choose to nurture within ourselves eventually shapes what we experience around us, because inner attitudes rarely remain hidden forever. Thoughts influence emotions. Emotions influence actions. Actions influence habits. Habits influence character. And character influences the direction of an entire life. This chain of influence operates whether we are aware of it or not. Every day, we are cultivating something within ourselves. We are strengthening certain patterns while weakening others. We are feeding either gratitude or resentment, humility or pride, patience or impulsiveness, courage or fear. The question is not whether growth is taking place. The question is what kind of growth is occurring. The story of Cain and Abel provides a powerful illustration of how small internal choices can produce enormous consequences over time. Cain did not arrive at destruction in a single step. His downfall began much earlier, in the way he interpreted events, managed emotions, and responded to disappointment. This progression remains relevant because destructive outcomes in modern life often follow a similar pattern. A person does not usually wake up one morning consumed by bitterness. Bitterness develops gradually through repeated focus on grievances. A person does not suddenly become controlled by envy. Envy grows through repeated comparison and repeated attention to what others possess. Likewise, positive qualities develop gradually. Confidence grows through repeated acts of courage. Gratitude grows through repeated recognition of blessings. Wisdom grows through repeated reflection and learning. Character is not built overnight. It is built choice by choice, day by day. This understanding offers hope because it means no one is trapped by their current mindset. People can change. Perspectives can change. Habits can change. Even deeply rooted patterns can change when individuals become willing to examine them honestly and replace them intentionally. History is filled with examples of people who transformed their lives not by changing their circumstances first, but by changing the way they viewed those circumstances. They learned to interpret challenges differently. They learned to respond to setbacks differently. They learned to focus on growth rather than comparison. Over time, those internal changes produced external results. One of the most practical ways to apply this lesson is through deliberate attention. Attention is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses because whatever receives attention tends to grow. If attention is constantly directed toward the achievements of others, comparison grows. If attention is directed toward personal development, growth grows. If attention is directed toward gratitude, appreciation grows. Many people underestimate the importance of attention because it seems passive, yet attention quietly shapes experience. Imagine two people living under similar circumstances. One spends hours each day focusing on what others have accomplished. The other spends those same hours improving skills, strengthening relationships, learning new ideas, and pursuing meaningful goals. After several years, the difference between them is likely to be significant. The divergence began not with dramatic actions, but with where attention was consistently directed. This is why guarding attention has become increasingly important in the modern world. Never before have people been exposed to so many opportunities for distraction and comparison. Every screen offers endless examples of someone who appears more successful, more attractive, wealthier, or more accomplished. Without awareness, attention can become fragmented and consumed by comparisons that contribute little to personal growth. The challenge is not avoiding awareness of other people altogether. The challenge is maintaining perspective. Other people's journeys can inform us, inspire us, and teach us valuable lessons. But they should not become the primary measure of our worth. Your life is not a competition against every person you encounter. It is a unique journey with its own challenges, opportunities, responsibilities, and purpose. The more clearly you understand that truth, the less power comparison has over you, and the more energy becomes available for creating a meaningful life of your own. The more energy that becomes available for creating a meaningful life of your own, the less tempted you are to live someone else's life in your imagination. One of the quiet tragedies of comparison is that it steals attention from the only life you can actually influence, your own. While you are preoccupied with another person's achievements, opportunities, or recognition, your own opportunities continue to pass by unnoticed. While you are measuring your progress against someone else's timeline, your own growth may be unfolding in ways you fail to appreciate. Comparison creates the illusion that the most important story is happening somewhere else, in someone else's career, someone else's relationship, someone else's success. Yet your greatest responsibility is not to live their story. It is to faithfully develop your own. This idea becomes especially important when we consider how different human journeys truly are. Every person begins from a different starting point. Every person faces different obstacles, receives different opportunities, possesses different strengths, and carries different responsibilities. Because of these differences, direct comparisons are often misleading. Imagine comparing two trees growing in different environments. One receives abundant sunlight and fertile soil. The other must grow in harsher conditions with fewer resources. Looking only at their height may tell you very little about the effort required for each to grow. Human lives are similar. The visible outcomes rarely reveal the full context. They do not reveal the sacrifices, struggles, fears, failures, and lessons that occurred behind the scenes. Yet comparison ignores context and focuses almost exclusively on results. This is one reason it produces such distorted conclusions. The story of Cain and Abel challenges this tendency by directing attention away from external outcomes and toward internal responses. The deeper question is not who received favor. The deeper question is how each person responded to the situation they faced. That question remains relevant because response is often more important than circumstance. Circumstances influence possibilities, but responses influence direction. Two individuals can encounter the same setback and move in completely different directions depending on how they respond. One becomes discouraged and withdraws. The other learns, adapts, and continues. The setback is the same. The response is different. Over time, those different responses create different futures. This principle can be observed repeatedly throughout life. In education, some students treat mistakes as evidence of inability, while others treat mistakes as opportunities to improve. In business, some entrepreneurs view failure as a final verdict, while others view it as feedback. In relationships, some people allow conflict to deepen understanding, while others allow conflict to create lasting resentment. The circumstances vary, but the underlying principle remains remarkably consistent. Responses matter. In fact, responses often matter more than people realize. Much of what determines long-term success is not a person's ability to avoid challenges, but their ability to respond constructively when challenges occur. This perspective shifts the focus away from outcomes that cannot always be controlled and toward behaviors that can. It encourages responsibility without promoting perfectionism. It acknowledges that life will include disappointment while emphasizing that disappointment does not have to determine destiny. This message is particularly powerful because it restores hope. If success depended entirely on circumstances, many people would have little reason to persevere. But if success is influenced by attitude, effort, learning, and response, then possibilities remain open even in difficult situations. The story of Cain and Abel illustrates both sides of this reality. It shows how destructive responses can lead toward tragedy. But by implication, it also shows how different responses could have produced a different future. That possibility matters because it reminds us that while we cannot rewrite the past, we can influence what comes next. Every day provides another opportunity to choose growth over resentment, gratitude over envy, responsibility over blame, and wisdom over impulse. Those choices may appear small, but over time they shape the story of a life. Those choices may appear small, but history repeatedly demonstrates that small choices often create the largest consequences. People tend to notice dramatic outcomes while overlooking the countless decisions that produce them. We see the successful business, but not the years of disciplined effort. We see the strong relationship, but not the daily acts of patience, honesty, and commitment. We see the confident individual, but not the repeated moments when fear was confronted rather than obeyed. Life is often shaped less by a few extraordinary decisions and more by thousands of ordinary ones. This truth lies at the heart of the lesson found in Cain and Abel. The story reminds us that character is formed gradually. Every thought entertained, every emotion encouraged, and every response chosen contributes to the person we are becoming. If resentment is repeatedly fed, it grows stronger. If gratitude is repeatedly practiced, it grows stronger. If comparison becomes a daily habit, dissatisfaction often follows. If personal growth becomes a daily habit, progress often follows. The direction of life is frequently determined by what we consistently nurture. Consider a gardener tending a field. The gardener cannot simply decide one day to produce a harvest and expect immediate results. The harvest reflects months of attention, cultivation, protection, and care. Certain seeds were planted. Certain weeds were removed. Certain conditions were encouraged. Human character develops in a similar way. Every day, we are planting seeds within our minds. Some seeds produce wisdom. Others produce bitterness. Some produce resilience. Others produce insecurity. The harvest eventually reflects what was cultivated. This metaphor is particularly relevant because Cain himself was a worker of the land. He would have understood the principle that growth follows cultivation. Yet the lesson applies just as powerfully to the inner life as it does to a physical field. Thoughts become habits when they are repeated often enough. Habits become character when they are practiced consistently enough. Character becomes destiny when it influences decision after decision over many years. Understanding this process helps explain why seemingly minor attitudes can have such significant consequences. A small amount of jealousy may appear harmless. A small amount of resentment may seem manageable. A small amount of self-pity may appear insignificant. But when these attitudes are continually reinforced, they become powerful forces that shape perception and behavior. The same is true of positive qualities. A small act of gratitude may seem insignificant. A small act of self-discipline may seem unremarkable. A small decision to respond with patience rather than anger may appear minor. Yet these choices accumulate. Over time, they strengthen qualities that improve both character and outcomes. This accumulation effect is one of the most overlooked realities of personal development. People often expect transformation to occur suddenly. They wait for a breakthrough moment, a dramatic realization, or a life-changing opportunity. While such moments can occur, lasting change usually emerges through consistent practice rather than sudden inspiration. Wisdom grows one lesson at a time. Confidence grows one courageous action at a time. Integrity grows one honest decision at a time. Likewise, resentment grows one grievance at a time. Envy grows one comparison at a time, and bitterness grows one unresolved disappointment at a time. The direction may be gradual, but it is rarely neutral. We are always becoming something. This realization invites an important question. What are you cultivating today? Not what do you hope to become someday, but what are you actively strengthening right now through your thoughts, attention, and choices? The answer to that question often reveals more about the future than any prediction could. The future is not determined entirely by circumstances. It is influenced by the qualities we develop before circumstances arrive. And those qualities are formed through the ordinary choices that most people overlook. The ordinary choices that most people overlook are often the very choices that determine whether a person grows stronger through adversity or becomes trapped by it. When we think about transformation, we are naturally drawn to dramatic stories because they are memorable. We admire individuals who overcome extraordinary obstacles, build remarkable achievements, or completely change the course of their lives. What is easy to miss, however, is that these transformations rarely begin with dramatic actions. More often, they begin with a subtle shift in thinking. A person decides to stop blaming and start learning. A person decides to stop comparing and start improving. A person decides to stop dwelling on what cannot be changed and start focusing on what can. These decisions may seem small in the moment, but they alter the trajectory of everything that follows. The story of Cain and Abel can be viewed through this lens. At its core, it is not merely a story about envy. It is a story about direction. It reveals how the direction of a life can change when certain thoughts are embraced and others are rejected. Cain's emotions were not unique. Every human being experiences disappointment. Every human being experiences frustration. Every human being experiences moments when life feels unfair. The crucial difference lies in what happens next. Do those experiences become fuel for growth or fuel for resentment? Do they inspire reflection or reinforce blame? Do they deepen wisdom or deepen bitterness? These questions remain relevant because life continually presents situations that test our answers. Imagine two individuals facing the same professional setback. Both are passed over for a promotion they deeply wanted. The first person becomes consumed by resentment. They spend months criticizing colleagues, replaying the disappointment, and focusing on perceived unfairness. The second person experiences the same disappointment but chooses a different response. They seek feedback, identify areas for improvement, strengthen their skills, and continue moving forward. A year later, their circumstances may look completely different, not because one person avoided disappointment, but because they responded differently to it. This illustrates an essential truth about personal development. Growth is not determined by what happens to us. Growth is determined by what we do with what happens to us. The distinction is subtle but profound. It shifts attention away from events and toward responses. It shifts focus away from what cannot be controlled and toward what can. This mindset does not deny reality. It does not pretend that obstacles are easy or that injustice never exists. Rather, it recognizes that even in difficult situations, choices remain. Attitudes remain. Responses remain. And those responses often influence outcomes more than people realize. The lesson becomes even more powerful when applied to relationships. Many conflicts persist not because the original problem was impossible to solve, but because pride, resentment, or comparison prevent constructive responses. People become more interested in proving they are right than in understanding each other. They become more focused on winning arguments than preserving trust. They compare contributions, sacrifices, and recognition instead of working towards shared goals. The result is unnecessary division. Yet relationships often improve when individuals shift from comparison to contribution. Instead of asking, "Am I receiving as much as the other person?" they ask, "How can I add value to this relationship?" This change in perspective creates cooperation where competition once existed. In many ways, the same principle applies to life itself. When people focus primarily on comparison, life feels like a contest. When people focus on contribution, life becomes an opportunity. Comparison narrows perspective because it centers attention on relative status. Contribution expands perspective because it centers attention on purpose and impact. The more a person focuses on contribution, the less vulnerable they become to the destructive effects of envy. They no longer need every success to belong to them. They no longer interpret another person's achievement as a personal loss. Instead, they measure progress by the value they create, the character they develop, and the positive influence they have on the world around them. The more a person measures progress by the value they create rather than by the status they achieve, the more resilient they become. Status is inherently unstable because it depends on comparison. Value, on the other hand, can be created regardless of how many people are ahead of you, behind you, richer than you, or more recognized than you. This distinction is liberating because it shifts attention away from factors that are often outside your control and toward actions that remain within your influence. Consider the difference between asking, "How can I become more successful than others?" and asking, "How can I become more useful, more capable, and more effective?" The first question encourages comparison. The second encourages growth. The first focuses on rank. The second focuses on contribution. The first can produce endless dissatisfaction because there is always someone else to surpass. The second creates continuous opportunity because there is always room for improvement. This principle helps explain why some people remain fulfilled even when they are not the most successful person in the room. Their sense of purpose is not tied exclusively to status. They derive meaning from growth, service, learning, relationships, and contribution. As a result, they are able to appreciate the achievements of others without feeling threatened by them. They understand that another person's success does not reduce their ability to create value. In fact, they often recognize that success is not a limited resource. One person's achievement can inspire, teach, and even create opportunities for others. The belief that success is limited is one of the hidden assumptions that fuels envy. When people view life as a fixed competition for value, recognition, or opportunity, they naturally become more defensive and comparative. Every victory by someone else appears to reduce what remains available. Yet many of the most important things in life do not operate according to this logic. Knowledge can be shared without being diminished. Kindness can be given without being depleted. Inspiration can spread without being exhausted. Even success itself often creates possibilities rather than eliminating them. A breakthrough by one person can reveal opportunities for many others. This abundance-oriented perspective stands in sharp contrast to the mindset that consumed Cain. His focus appears to have narrowed until all he could see was the difference between himself and his brother. When perspective narrows in this way, reality becomes distorted. The mind becomes preoccupied with a single comparison while overlooking countless other possibilities. Modern life provides many examples of this phenomenon. A person may have supportive relationships, meaningful work, good health, and opportunities for growth, yet remain unhappy because attention is fixed on one area where someone else appears to have more. This is not because their life lacks value. It is because comparison has redirected attention away from that value. Attention is powerful. Whatever consistently occupies attention tends to influence emotions, perceptions, and behavior. This is why gratitude remains such a powerful practice. Gratitude does not require denying challenges or pretending that problems do not exist. It simply broadens perspective. It reminds us that reality contains more than what is missing. It encourages recognition of what is present, what is working, and what has already been given. When gratitude becomes habitual, comparison loses much of its influence because attention is no longer dominated by scarcity. Instead of constantly asking, "What do I lack?" the mind begins asking, "What can I build with what I have?" This shift changes the emotional experience of life. It replaces helplessness with possibility. It replaces envy with appreciation. It replaces fixation on external circumstances with engagement in meaningful action. Over time, these changes accumulate and shape character. A grateful person is not necessarily someone with fewer problems. More often, a grateful person is someone who has learned to see beyond those problems. They have learned to recognize blessings without becoming blind to challenges and to pursue improvement without becoming imprisoned by comparison. To pursue improvement without becoming imprisoned by comparison is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. It allows ambition and contentment to coexist. Many people assume these qualities are opposites. They believe that if they become content, they will lose their motivation. Or they believe that if they remain ambitious, they must remain dissatisfied. Yet the most balanced individuals often demonstrate that both qualities can exist together. They are grateful for what they have while still working toward what they hope to become. They appreciate the present without abandoning the future. They strive for excellence without basing their worth on outcomes. This balance protects them from many of the emotional traps that comparison creates. The story of Cain and Abel illustrates what can happen when this balance is lost. Cain's attention became fixed on what he lacked rather than on what he could still do. His disappointment narrowed his vision until he could no longer see possibilities for growth. This narrowing of perspective is one of the most dangerous effects of negative emotion. Strong emotions often convince us that the way we feel in a particular moment accurately represents reality. Anger makes situations appear more threatening. Fear makes challenges appear larger. Envy makes differences appear more significant. Resentment makes people appear more hostile. While emotions provide useful information, they do not always provide accurate conclusions. This is why wisdom requires more than simply following feelings. Wisdom involves examining feelings, learning from them, and then deciding whether they deserve to influence action. Consider how often people make decisions they later regret because they acted while overwhelmed by emotion. A harsh message is sent in anger. A relationship is damaged by pride. An opportunity is abandoned because of fear. A friendship is weakened by jealousy. In many of these situations, the emotion itself was temporary, but the consequences of acting on it were lasting. This reality highlights the importance of emotional discipline. Emotional discipline does not mean becoming cold or detached. It means recognizing that feelings are experiences, not commands. They deserve attention, but not unquestioned obedience. The ability to create this distinction can transform relationships, careers, and personal growth. It allows people to respond according to principles rather than impulses. One practical way to strengthen emotional discipline is through reflection. Reflection creates distance between experience and interpretation. It allows individuals to ask questions that emotions alone rarely encourage. Is my reaction proportional to the situation? What assumptions am I making? Am I viewing this event objectively? Or am I interpreting it through the lens of insecurity, pride, or fear? These questions help reveal hidden influences that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Reflection also creates opportunities for learning. Every disappointment contains information. Every mistake contains information. Every emotional reaction contains information. The challenge is that information is only useful if it is examined. Many people experience the same lessons repeatedly because they never stop to ask what those experiences might be teaching them. Growth requires more than experience. It requires awareness. Awareness transforms life from a series of events into a source of education. The story of Cain and Abel continues to resonate because it offers such an opportunity for reflection. It encourages us to look beyond the actions and examine the emotions, beliefs, and perspectives that produce them. In doing so, it reveals something important about human nature. The greatest threats to our well-being are not always external. Sometimes they originate within us. Sometimes the obstacle is not another person, another circumstance, or another challenge. Sometimes the obstacle is a pattern of thinking that distorts reality and undermines growth. The good news is that patterns can be changed. Perspectives can be challenged. Habits can be replaced. Just as destructive thoughts can shape a life over time, constructive thoughts can shape a life as well. The process may be gradual, but its impact can be profound. Every moment of awareness creates an opportunity to choose a better direction. Every moment of awareness creates an opportunity to choose a better direction. And this is perhaps one of the most hopeful lessons hidden within the story of Cain and Abel. No matter how deeply a person has been influenced by comparison, envy, resentment, or insecurity, a different path remains possible. Human beings are not prisoners of their first reaction. They are not permanently defined by their past mistakes. They are not required to continue repeating the same emotional patterns forever. Change becomes possible the moment awareness enters the process. Awareness interrupts autopilot. It allows a person to step back from an emotion and observe it rather than becoming consumed by it. This may sound simple, but it is one of the most powerful abilities a person can develop. Consider how much of life is governed by automatic reactions. Someone criticizes us, and we become defensive. Someone succeeds, and we feel threatened. Someone disagrees with us, and we become angry. These responses often happen so quickly that they appear inevitable. Yet awareness creates a pause. Within that pause, new possibilities emerge. Instead of reacting automatically, we can respond intentionally. Instead of reinforcing an old pattern, we can create a new one. Over time, these moments of intentional choice reshape character. This process is not always easy because old patterns are familiar. Even destructive habits can feel comfortable simply because they are known. A person who has spent years comparing themselves to others may find it difficult to stop. A person who has relied on resentment as an explanation for disappointment may find responsibility uncomfortable. A person who has based self-worth on external validation may feel uncertain when trying to build confidence from within. Yet discomfort is often a sign that growth is occurring. Growth requires moving beyond familiar patterns and exploring healthier alternatives. In many ways, personal development is the gradual replacement of unconscious habits with conscious choices. The more conscious a person becomes, the more freedom they gain. This connection between awareness and freedom is important because many people misunderstand freedom. They assume freedom means the ability to do whatever they feel like doing in a given moment. But if emotions control every action, is that truly freedom? If jealousy determines behavior, if anger dictates decisions, if comparison shapes identity, then a person remains controlled by forces they do not fully understand. Real freedom involves the ability to choose responses rather than simply obey impulses. It involves acting according to values, principles, and long-term goals rather than momentary emotions. This kind of freedom requires self-knowledge. The better you understand your fears, insecurities, motivations, and tendencies, the less power they have over you. Self-knowledge transforms hidden influences into visible ones. Once visible, they can be examined, challenged, and changed. This is why honest reflection remains one of the most valuable practices a person can cultivate. Reflection reveals patterns that would otherwise remain invisible. It helps explain recurring frustrations, repeated mistakes, and persistent emotional reactions. More importantly, it creates opportunities for improvement. The purpose of reflection is not self-criticism. The purpose is understanding. Understanding creates the foundation for growth. Imagine trying to improve a skill without understanding your weaknesses. Progress would be slow and inconsistent. The same principle applies to character. Growth becomes much easier when you understand the patterns that influence your behavior. The story of Cain and Abel encourages exactly this kind of examination. It invites us to ask difficult but important questions. Where does comparison appear in my life? What successes of others trigger insecurity within me? What disappointments have I allowed to become sources of resentment? What beliefs am I carrying that may be limiting my growth? These questions are not always comfortable, but they are valuable because they direct attention toward areas where transformation is possible. And transformation, more often than not, begins with a single moment of honest awareness followed by a willingness to choose a different path. A willingness to choose a different path is what separates people who remain trapped by their circumstances from those who grow beyond them. At some point, every meaningful transformation requires a decision. Not necessarily a dramatic decision that changes everything overnight, but a sincere commitment to stop feeding destructive patterns and start cultivating healthier ones. The reason this commitment matters is that awareness alone is not enough. A person can recognize the damage caused by comparison and still continue comparing. A person can understand the dangers of resentment and still choose to nurture it. Knowledge creates possibility, but action creates change. The story of Cain and Abel illustrates the consequences of failing to act on what is known. The warning existed. The opportunity for reflection existed. The possibility of choosing a different response existed. Yet awareness was not translated into action. This distinction remains deeply relevant because modern life is filled with information but often lacking in transformation. Many people know what would improve their lives. They know the value of gratitude. They know the importance of self-discipline. They understand the dangers of envy, bitterness, and blame. Yet understanding alone rarely produces results. Change occurs when understanding becomes practice. This is where the story becomes intensely practical. It moves beyond philosophy and enters daily life. Consider the workplace. Comparison is everywhere. Employees compare salaries, promotions, recognition, responsibilities, and opportunities. Some of this comparison is natural, but problems arise when comparison becomes the primary lens through which work is viewed. A person may receive meaningful opportunities for growth and still feel dissatisfied because someone else appears to be advancing more quickly. Another may overlook their own progress because attention is fixed on a colleague's achievements. Over time, this mindset can erode motivation and create unnecessary frustration. A healthier approach focuses on contribution and development. Instead of constantly asking, "How do I compare?" a person asks, "How can I improve?" The first question often leads to anxiety. The second leads to action. The same lesson applies to finances. Financial comparison has become one of the most common sources of stress in modern society. People compare homes, vehicles, vacations, investments, incomes, and lifestyles. As a result, many feel perpetually behind, regardless of their actual financial situation. Yet financial peace rarely comes from winning a comparison. There will always be someone with more. Financial peace comes from clarity, stewardship, and alignment between resources and values. It comes from understanding that wealth is a tool, not an identity. When people tie their self-worth to financial status, they become vulnerable to endless dissatisfaction because comparison continually shifts the standard. Family relationships are also affected by the lessons of Cain and Abel. Sibling rivalry, jealousy, favoritism, and competition have existed for generations. Many family conflicts begin when individuals compare attention, opportunities, recognition, or achievements. Instead of appreciating different strengths, family members compete for validation. Instead of celebrating each other's success, they interpret success as a threat. Yet healthy families understand something important. One person's growth does not diminish another person's value. Love is not a limited resource. Respect is not a limited resource. Encouragement is not a limited resource. Families flourish when members learn to support rather than compete with one another. Romantic relationships reveal a similar truth. Comparison can quietly damage even strong partnerships. People compare their relationships to carefully curated images online. They compare their partner to unrealistic expectations. They compare current realities to imagined alternatives. In doing so, they often overlook the value already present in their lives. Gratitude becomes difficult when attention is dominated by comparison. Appreciation fades when imagination constantly searches for something better. Strong relationships require the discipline to focus on reality rather than fantasy, contribution rather than entitlement, and appreciation rather than constant evaluation. These principles may sound simple, but their cumulative effect can transform the quality of a person's work, finances, relationships, and emotional well-being. They remind us that the lessons hidden within an ancient story are not confined to the past. They remain relevant because human nature remains remarkably consistent across generations. Human nature remains remarkably consistent across generations, which is why stories written thousands of years ago can still speak directly to modern lives. Technology has changed. Cultures have changed. Economies have changed. Yet the fundamental struggles of the human heart remain surprisingly familiar. People still seek meaning. They still wrestle with insecurity. They still long for recognition. They still struggle with disappointment. They still compare themselves to others. And because these challenges remain, the wisdom contained within ancient stories remains relevant as well. The story of Cain and Abel endures not because it provides a historical account alone, but because it reveals timeless truths about how people respond to success, failure, and the achievements of others. One of those truths is that envy rarely stays contained. Many emotions affect only the person experiencing them, but envy has a unique tendency to spread. It damages the way people see themselves, the way they see others, and the way they interpret reality. It turns admiration into resentment. It turns inspiration into discouragement. It turns relationships into competitions. Left unchecked, it can influence decisions in ways that affect entire families, organizations, and communities. This is why learning to celebrate the success of others is such a powerful practice. At first, celebrating another person's success may feel unnatural, especially when we desire similar success ourselves. Yet it represents a profound shift in perspective. It signals that we no longer view life as a battle for limited worth. It demonstrates confidence that another person's achievement does not threaten our value. More importantly, it strengthens qualities that contribute to emotional health and meaningful relationships. People who genuinely celebrate the achievements of others often experience greater peace because they are no longer trapped in constant competition. Their attention is free to focus on learning, growing, and contributing rather than comparing. This freedom creates a more sustainable foundation for happiness. It also improves relationships. Think about the people you most enjoy being around. They are often individuals who encourage rather than compete, who support rather than resent, who celebrate rather than diminish. Such people create environments where growth becomes easier because others feel safe to succeed. In contrast, environments dominated by comparison often become toxic. Individuals hide successes, fear criticism, and hesitate to support one another because every achievement feels politically significant. The lesson extends beyond personal relationships into leadership as well. Great leaders understand that their role is not to be the most important person in every room. Their role is to help others develop, contribute, and succeed. Leaders who are threatened by the abilities of others often create weak organizations because they suppress talent. Leaders who are secure in themselves create strong organizations because they encourage talent. The difference frequently comes down to whether they operate from comparison or confidence. Confidence welcomes excellence in others. Insecurity fears it. This distinction is particularly important because many people misunderstand confidence. True confidence is not arrogance. It is not the belief that you are superior to everyone else. It is the belief that your worth does not depend on being superior. Arrogance requires comparison because it seeks validation through superiority. Confidence does not. Confidence allows a person to acknowledge strengths without denying weaknesses. It allows them to admire others without feeling diminished. It allows them to pursue ambitious goals without becoming emotionally dependent on outcomes. This kind of confidence represents one of the most effective antidotes to envy. When individuals know their value, they no longer need every comparison to favor them. They can appreciate another person's strengths without questioning their own. They can learn from excellence rather than feeling threatened by it. They can remain grounded during both success and failure because their identity rests on something deeper than external results. In many ways, this is one of the central lessons that the story of Cain and Abel invites us to learn. The danger was never simply another person's success. The danger was allowing that success to define personal worth. Once worth becomes dependent on comparison, peace becomes fragile. When worth is rooted in character, growth, and purpose, peace becomes far more resilient. When worth is rooted in character, growth, and purpose, peace becomes far more resilient because it is no longer dependent on constantly changing circumstances. Circumstances rise and fall. Success comes and goes. Public recognition appears and disappears. Financial conditions improve and deteriorate. Relationships experience seasons of strength and seasons of difficulty. If identity is tied exclusively to these external factors, emotional stability becomes nearly impossible. A person will constantly fluctuate between confidence and insecurity depending on whatever happens around them. Yet when identity is rooted in deeper foundations, external events lose much of their power to determine internal well-being. This does not mean that setbacks stop hurting or that success stops feeling rewarding. It simply means that neither success nor failure becomes the final authority on personal value. This distinction is one of the greatest sources of emotional strength. Think about the people you admire most. Chances are, the qualities that make them admirable extend beyond achievement alone. Perhaps they demonstrate integrity when no one is watching. Perhaps they remain humble despite success. Perhaps they show courage in difficult situations. Perhaps they treat others with kindness and respect regardless of status. These qualities are significant because they reveal character rather than circumstance. Circumstances can change quickly. Character tends to endure. This is why character often becomes a better predictor of long-term fulfillment than short-term success. A person with strong character can recover from setbacks, learn from mistakes, and maintain meaningful relationships. A person with external success but weak character may struggle to sustain what they have built. The story of Cain and Abel highlights this contrast in a profound way. The event that triggered the conflict was temporary. The character revealed by the response had much deeper consequences. In many ways, life continually presents similar opportunities. Every challenge reveals something about us. Every disappointment reveals something about us. Every success reveals something about us. The question is whether we are willing to pay attention to what is being revealed. This requires honesty, and honesty is not always comfortable. Honest self-examination may uncover insecurity where we prefer confidence. It may reveal envy where we prefer generosity. It may expose pride where we prefer humility. Yet without honesty, growth becomes difficult because people cannot improve what they refuse to acknowledge. The purpose of self-examination is not self-condemnation. It is self-awareness. Awareness allows individuals to address weaknesses without becoming defined by them. It creates opportunities for transformation. In this sense, self-awareness is an act of hope because it assumes change is possible. If change were impossible, there would be little reason to examine ourselves honestly. But because growth is possible, self-examination becomes valuable. Every insight provides an opportunity to move in a better direction. This process is especially important in a world that often encourages external focus. Modern culture constantly directs attention outward. It encourages people to monitor trends, compare achievements, evaluate appearances, and seek approval. While some external awareness is necessary, an exclusively outward focus can leave little room for inner development. People become skilled at managing appearances while neglecting character. They become concerned with how life looks rather than how life is actually being lived. The lesson of Cain and Abel challenges this tendency. It reminds us that the most important aspects of life are often invisible. Character is invisible. Intentions are invisible. Motives are invisible. Values are invisible. Yet these unseen qualities frequently determine visible outcomes. A strong building depends on a strong foundation, even though the foundation remains hidden beneath the surface. Human lives operate in much the same way. External achievements may attract attention, but internal qualities determine whether those achievements can be handled wisely and sustained over time. For this reason, personal growth is not merely about accomplishing more. It is about becoming more. And becoming more begins with the choices we make when no one else is watching. And becoming more begins with the choices we make when no one else is watching, because those are the moments when our true priorities become visible. Public behavior is often influenced by expectations, consequences, and the opinions of others. Private behavior reveals something deeper. It reveals what we genuinely value when external pressures are removed. This is why character cannot be measured solely by public accomplishments. Character is demonstrated in everyday decisions that rarely receive attention or applause. It appears in how a person responds to disappointment when there is no audience. It appears in how they treat others when there is nothing to gain. It appears in whether they choose growth over resentment, responsibility over blame, and integrity over convenience. The story of Cain and Abel ultimately invites us into this deeper examination. It is easy to read the story and focus on the dramatic outcome. It is more challenging and more valuable to focus on the internal process that led there. By doing so, we begin to recognize similar processes within ourselves. We begin to notice how comparison influences our emotions, how emotions influence our choices, and how choices influence our lives. This awareness is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce wisdom. Wisdom grows when we recognize patterns before they control us. It grows when we learn from examples rather than repeating them. It grows when we understand that small attitudes, repeated consistently, can shape entire destinies. One of the greatest gifts of wisdom is perspective. Perspective allows us to see beyond the immediate moment. It reminds us that today's disappointment is not necessarily tomorrow's outcome. It reminds us that another person's success is not evidence of our failure. It reminds us that temporary emotions do not have to become permanent identities. Without perspective, people often make decisions based on what they feel right now. With perspective, they can make decisions based on what they value most over time. This difference can change everything. Consider how many regrets originate from short-term thinking. A moment of anger damages a long-term relationship. A moment of envy destroys a valuable friendship. A moment of pride prevents necessary growth. In each case, immediate emotions overshadowed broader perspective. Wisdom restores that perspective. It asks questions that emotions often ignore. What will matter a year from now? What kind of person do I want to become? Will this response move me toward that person or away from that person? These questions shift attention from temporary feelings to lasting values. The more often people ask such questions, the more intentional their lives become. Intentional living stands in direct contrast to reactive living. Reactive living is driven primarily by circumstances. When circumstances are favorable, confidence rises. When circumstances are difficult, confidence collapses. When praise arrives, motivation increases. When criticism arrives, motivation disappears. Intentional living operates differently. It is guided by principles that remain stable even when circumstances change. It does not ignore emotions, but it refuses to be ruled by them. It does not deny challenges, but it refuses to be defined by them. It recognizes that while external events cannot always be controlled, responses can often be chosen. This perspective is empowering because it places responsibility where it belongs. It does not suggest that life is always fair or that every outcome is deserved. Rather, It emphasizes that regardless of circumstances, people retain the ability to choose their attitudes, values, and responses. That ability may be limited at times, but it is rarely absent. And within that ability lies the potential for transformation. The story of Cain and Abel continues to resonate because it reminds us of both danger and possibility. It warns us about the destructive power of comparison, envy, and unchecked emotion. At the same time, it points toward a better path, one rooted in self-awareness, gratitude, responsibility, character, and growth. The choice between those paths remains as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago, and each day provides another opportunity to decide which path we will follow. Each day provides another opportunity to decide which path we will follow. And that is what makes this ancient story so powerful. It is not merely a story about two brothers who lived long ago. It is a mirror held up to every generation. Within that mirror, we see our own struggles reflected back at us. We see the moments when we feel overlooked. We see the moments when someone else receives what we hope to receive. We see the moments when comparison whispers that our value depends on how we measure up against others. And we see the moments when we must choose what to do with those feelings. In that sense, the story is not only about Cain and Abel. It is about all of us. Every person faces situations that test character. Every person encounters moments when resentment seems easier than responsibility. Every person experiences disappointment that could either become a source of wisdom or a source of bitterness. The difference often comes down to a single decision, whether we will allow our emotions to control us or whether we will learn from them and move forward. This decision rarely happens once. It happens repeatedly. It happens in workplaces when colleagues succeed. It happens in families when siblings receive attention or opportunities. It happens in friendships when one person's life seems to advance more quickly than another's. It happens online when carefully edited images create the illusion that everyone else is happier, wealthier, more attractive, or more successful. In each of these moments, comparison offers an invitation. The question is whether we accept it. The invitation may seem harmless at first. It asks us to measure, evaluate, and rank ourselves against others. Yet the longer we accept that invitation, the more our attention drifts away from our own path. We begin to focus less on becoming the best version of ourselves and more on determining where we stand in relation to everyone else. Over time, this shift can quietly steal joy, gratitude, confidence, and peace. What makes comparison especially dangerous is that it disguises itself as self-improvement. It convinces people that they are simply trying to succeed. In reality, many are trying to feel worthy. Those are not the same thing. Success can be pursued in a healthy way. Worthiness does not need to be earned through comparison. Human value is not a prize awarded only to the most successful, the most admired, or the most accomplished. Value exists before achievement. Achievement may reveal abilities, but it does not create worth. This distinction is essential because it changes the way we approach life. When people believe they must earn worth through comparison, they live in constant fear of being surpassed. When people understand that worth exists independently of comparison, they are free to pursue excellence without anxiety dominating the process. They can celebrate progress without becoming arrogant. They can experience setbacks without becoming hopeless. They can admire others without feeling diminished. This freedom transforms the pursuit of success. Success becomes an expression of growth rather than a desperate search for validation. The irony is that people often perform better when they are no longer obsessed with proving themselves. Their energy is no longer consumed by comparison. Their attention is no longer divided by insecurity. Instead, they focus on learning, contributing, improving, and creating value. This mindset produces not only better results, but also a healthier experience of life. It allows individuals to enjoy the journey rather than postponing happiness until some future milestone is reached. The story of Cain and Abel reminds us that every life contains a choice between these two approaches. One approach is driven by comparison, resentment, and the need to measure worth externally. The other is guided by growth, gratitude, responsibility, and the recognition that true value comes from something deeper. One path narrows life, the other expands it. One path creates conflict within and around us. The other creates the conditions for wisdom, peace, and meaningful progress. The choice remains available every single day, often in moments so small that they seem insignificant. Yet those moments quietly shape the direction of an entire life. Those moments quietly shape the direction of an entire life, which is why the final lesson of Cain and Abel is not one of condemnation, but of choice. The story endures because it reminds us that while we cannot always control what happens around us, we can influence what grows within us. We cannot control every opportunity that comes our way. We cannot control every success enjoyed by others. We cannot control every setback, disappointment, or unfair circumstance we encounter. But we can control what we choose to cultivate in response. We can cultivate gratitude instead of resentment. We can cultivate responsibility instead of blame. We can cultivate self-awareness instead of denial. We can cultivate growth instead of comparison. These choices may seem small, but they determine the quality of our inner world, and the quality of our inner world eventually shapes the quality of our lives. Perhaps that is the deepest warning hidden within the story. The greatest threat to our future is not always another person's success. It is the way we choose to interpret that success. It is the story we tell ourselves about what it means. If we interpret another person's achievement as proof of our inadequacy, we surrender our peace. If we interpret it as evidence of possibility, we gain motivation. If we allow disappointment to become bitterness, we strengthen the very forces that limit our growth. If we allow disappointment to become a teacher, we transform pain into wisdom. The difference is not in the event itself. The difference is in the response. And response is where personal power resides. Imagine how different life becomes when you stop measuring your worth against other people. Imagine the freedom of celebrating another person's success without feeling threatened by it. Imagine the confidence that comes from knowing your value does not depend on being richer, smarter, more admired, or more accomplished than someone else. Imagine directing all the energy currently spent on comparison toward becoming wiser, stronger, kinder, more disciplined, and more purposeful. The results would not appear overnight, but they would accumulate. Day by day, choice by choice, thought by thought, a different life would begin to emerge. A life less controlled by insecurity. A life less distracted by envy. A life more focused on growth, contribution, and meaning. That is the path the story quietly points toward. It is not a path of perfection. It is a path of awareness. It is not a path where disappointment never occurs. It is a path where disappointment becomes an opportunity to learn rather than a reason to resent. It is not a path where success is guaranteed. It is a path where self-worth no longer depends on success. Thousands of years after the story of Cain and Abel was first told, its message remains remarkably relevant. The hidden danger of comparison still threatens peace. The temptation of envy still influences decisions. The challenge of managing emotions still shapes destinies. Yet the opportunity for wisdom remains available as well. Every day, each of us chooses what to cultivate. Every day, each of us chooses which thoughts deserve attention and which emotions deserve authority. Every day, Each of us decides whether to become consumed by comparison or committed to growth. So the next time you encounter someone who appears more successful, more talented, or further ahead than you, remember this ancient lesson. Their success does not diminish your value. Their achievements do not define your identity. Their journey is not your journey. Focus on your own growth. Strengthen your own character. Learn from others without measuring your worth against them. And above all, guard your heart against the quiet poison of comparison, because the life you are meant to build can only be built when your attention is focused not on who someone else is becoming, but on who you are becoming. That is where true growth begins. That is where lasting peace is found. And that is the lesson Cain never learned, but one that still has the power to transform our lives today.